Something is wrong. It's not the tiredness in the body nor the weight on the shoulders. It's a deeper absence, as if something inside you has silently withdrawn, as if what you feel no longer has a place. Today, even suffering requires permission. Cry, if you are alone. Complain, only if it is done lightly. Feel pain, only if it is discreet, without disturbing. And the cruelest? It's just that no one needed to tell you this with words. You learned by looking around. The eyes that look away when you are silent. The hasty advice. The invitations to gratitude. The empty compliments. Whenever you swallow yet another anguish with a smile on your face. We live in a time where looking good has become a requirement, and this demand, little by little, taught you to perform a presence that is not yours. It trained you to smile by reflex. It shaped you to be functional, even when you're in ruins. What no one tells you is that this type of positivity is an elegant form of violence. She doesn't shout, she doesn't hit, she doesn't force, but he is silent, and by remaining silent, he becomes ill. Decades ago, one man stood up against this, not with weapons nor with self-help slogans, but with a listening ear. A look that pierced the surface and dared to ask, what if your pain is an attempt at language? What if the symptom is not a mistake but a symbol that no one is translating? James Hillman didn't want to fix anyone. I wanted to listen to the soul. And listening to the soul today is almost an act of resistance. Because culture has taught us to run away from anything that doesn't fit. Sadness became a defect. Silence became disinterest. Anguish turned into drama. But the soul? It doesn't function under the logic of good behavior. She doesn't want to be cured in a hurry. She wants to be heard. And when it isn't, you start screaming inside. With symptoms, with exhaustion, with that strange emptiness that no distraction can fill. Have you ever felt this? One day everything seems fine. The next you wake up feeling lost, without knowing why. A longing that has no name. A desire to disappear, not from the world, but from the obligation to appear whole. This is the soul trying to exist in an environment where everything needs to seem resolved. She doesn't want your success, not even your image. She wants presence, and presence does not go with pretense. The problem is not wanting to be well. The problem is not being able to be bad. It's not having space to disassemble a little, to fall without fear of being discarded. Because in this emotional system into which we have been thrown, only those who are not burdened are accepted. Who is always available, who doesn't cry too much, who gives thanks even when they bleed. And so, you teach yourself to keep quiet. The soul, when it finds no ears, finds other forms. She speaks in the body, in the absence of air, in insomnia, in the apathy that no one understands, in the anger you feel, but don't know where it comes from. And the most dangerous thing, that's when you start to think the problem is with you. That feeling all this is weakness. That you should be better, more grateful, more optimistic. No, you should be listening, because every legitimate pain has a reason, even if you don't know what it is yet, even if no one else can see it. The psychology of the soul is not interested in what is visible. She dives into the invisible that sustains everything. She knows that what you call a crisis may just be the soul trying to breathe after being contained for so long. And that's why seeking happiness at any cost is making you sick, because this quest, as it was taught, requires you to cancel out everything that doesn't look beautiful, anything that isn't light, anything that doesn't match the images we've learned to post. But what do you really feel? Where is this? Where is the fear of not being able to cope? The exhaustion of having to pretend to be balanced all the time? Guilt for not being able to be as expected? All of this is being pushed into the basement, until the basement overflows. There is no real healing where pain needs to hide. And maybe this is the beginning of the turnaround. Stop running. Stop trying to look strong. Stop seeking happiness that costs your own truth. The soul does not want to live smiling. She wants to live with meaning. And meaning sometimes comes from sadness, of unlived mourning, of unresolved love, of the loneliness that you still haven't had the courage to look head on. It's all part of it. All this is the soul wanting space. You are not broken. You are trying to exist in a world that teaches you to abandon yourself in order to be accepted. But there is another way, a darker, slower, deeper path, a path where your pain has a place, and your sadness doesn't need to apologize to exist. This path begins when you stop trying to be well, and he begins to seek to be whole. The soul does not want quick solutions. She doesn't want motivation. She doesn't want optimism. She wants to be heard. And listening to the soul is very different from trying to fix what it's feeling. We were taught that being sad is a problem, that suffering is something to be eliminated, silenced, overcome, that any pain is a sign that something is wrong. But what if it isn't? What if pain is just the soul's way of asking for space? No space to be healed, but space to exist. Psychology that comes from the soul understands that suffering is not a system error. It's an appeal, a gesture, a symbolic attempt to bring to light something that has been hidden for a long time. And whenever you try to be okay by force, you stifle that gesture. You tell your soul, not now, not the time, let's wait for later. And the soul is left for later, for after work, for after the others, so that it seems resolved afterward, until she disappears from her own body. You keep living, continues to fulfill commitments, keep answering messages, laughing in the right place, keeping up appearances. But inside, something comes unglued. You start to feel like you're faking it even to yourself. Start laughing at things that don't affect you, saying, everything is fine, when everything is dense and disorganized. Looking in the mirror and seeing a reflection that complies but doesn't feel. This disconnection is a kind of symbolic death, not because something was destroyed, but because something stopped being heard. The soul dramatizes images. She needs metaphors, symbols, breaths. She tells stories with feelings, dreams, pains, not with logic or productivity. And when these images cannot emerge, when life is reduced to maintaining functionality, what dies is not the body. It is the link with what makes you human. That's why so many people go into crisis without understanding why. Everything fine on the outside, and a growing abyss within. This is the soul saying, I was not heard. The problem isn't that you're not happy. The problem is that you have learned that you need to be. Who only deserves to be loved if he is well. Which will only be accepted if it is not a burden. Which will only be respected if it demonstrates balance. But balance, when it demands silence from pain, is oppression in disguise. It's a prison with pillows. The soul does not want to be happy. It wants to be true, want to be able to swing. You want to be able to say, I don't know, I can't handle it, I don't understand. You want to be able to stumble and not be discarded for it. The world demands emotional masks, smiles that don't feel, reactions that do not come from within, postures that fit into the aesthetics of social acceptance. And every time you adapt to that script, a part of your soul contracts, until what's left is a polite, gentle, and empty presence. This soulless politeness is what silently consumes so many people, because it is not perceived as a problem. She is admired. They admire his strength, your optimism, your ability to move forward, but nobody sees the price. No one sees how much it costs to ignore one's own pain in the name of acceptance, how tiring it is to represent stability when inside there is only contained collapse. It is a kind of invisible suffering, but what devastation. Archetypal psychology understands this. She knows that the soul is theatrical by nature, that she needs to dramatize her conflicts, that needs to represent what you feel, even if it is absurd, dark, contradictory. And if this internal theater is not allowed, it takes revenge on the body, in relationships, in existential boredom, in the lack of meaning that appears out of nowhere. Have you ever wondered why, even though you're doing everything right, you sometimes feel like you're living out of obligation? Maybe it's because the most alive part of you never had room to truly exist. She was raised to restrain herself, hiding anger, to silence the thief, minimizing pain, looking mature when everything inside was imploding. But maturity is not that. Maturity is having the courage to listen to what no one wants to hear, even within you. It's saying, this hurts, and I'm not going to ignore it. It confuses me, and I don't need to understand it now. It scares me, and yet, I'll look. The soul reorganizes itself when it is listened to without haste, not with explanations, not with ready-made phrases, but with presence. The simple decision to stop, breathe, and allow yourself to feel is already a form of healing. Healing not as immediate relief, but as reconnection, like a reunion with what was left behind inside you, with the boy or woman who had to smile too soon, with the teenager who learned to keep quiet so as not to be rejected, with the adult who became a caregiver and forgot to take care of himself. All of this is still there, under the fatigue, under the rush, underneath the everything is fine. The soul doesn't want you to be happy. She wants you to be whole, with its flaws, with its voids, with its pieces still bruised, because that's how she starts breathing again. And when the soul breathes, life changes color, not because it became lighter, but why did you stop running away? And for the first time in a long time, you started to really listen. And what you hear, perhaps, is not pretty. It does not come in the form of clear sentences or enlightened ideas. It comes in the form of a symptom, from a tiredness that knocks you down for no apparent reason, from a growing irritation with everything and everyone, a desire to disappear, even when surrounded by people. The symptom is not a noise, it is language, but the mind, trained to function, to resolve, to put out emotional fires, rushes to classify, diagnose, neutralize, anxiety, scam, discouragement, words that name but do not listen, words that explain but do not translate, because what you feel is not just a dysfunction, it's a symbol. Something inside wants to reveal itself. Something is asking for translation. The psychology of the soul understands that the symptom is a character in the internal drama. It's not there by mistake. He is part of the play. He enters the scene when the soul finds no other way to show itself. And every time you try to eliminate the symptom without listening to it, it's like you're telling the only character who's still trying to save the story to shut up. Of course suffering hurts. Of course no one wants to wake up with a tight chest, or go to sleep without being able to breathe peacefully. But what if all of this is the last resort of a part of you that has been forgotten? What if what you call anxiety is actually your soul trying to wake you up to a conflict you've been ignoring for years? If discouragement is just the most honest way of saying, it's not here, it's not like this, it's not with these choices? What if exhaustion is a limit of the soul, and not just the body? Medicine tells you to recover. Society asks you to react. The soul, in silence, begs you, listen. You don't need to react, needs translation, because the symptom is an image. He carries an untold story, an unspoken pain, a decision you didn't have the courage to make, a path you were not allowed to follow. And he continues there, insisting, repeating himself, not out of cruelty, but for fidelity. The symptom is true to what you denied. He does not abandon you, because he is the only proof that something inside still beats, still insists, still has not come to terms with a life lived halfway. But it is difficult to listen to the symptom without rushing, without judgment, because we were taught to fear anything that takes us off the production line, doubting everything that doesn't work, doesn't fit, doesn't improve with a little willpower. That's why so many people try to silence the symptom with productivity, with forced spirituality, with performative optimism. But trying to heal the soul with positivity is like throwing glitter on a fire. It doesn't erase, just hide it. It just spreads more. The soul does not want shine, want depth. She prefers true darkness to artificial light, prefers symbolic discomfort to emotional anesthesia. And when the ego refuses to translate the symptom, it is actually refusing the chance to transform itself, because every forgotten image, every denied feeling, returns in the form of a symptom. And what doesn't become a symbol becomes pain. Have you ever felt this? A weight on the chest that is not fear, an absence of joy that is not sadness, an emptiness in the middle of the day even after laughter and achievements. This is the soul asking for translation. It is the symbol trying to be born from within, but without space. Because the modern ego wants efficiency, want quick answers. You want to solve everything with mantras, with techniques, with manuals. But the soul does not reveal itself on demand. It appears when you give up control, when you stop trying to overcome the pain and start talking to it. This takes time, courage, silence, and above all, presence. Presence to look at the symptom as if looking at a dream, not to interpret technically, but to feel what he means. What does this pain remind me of? Where else have I felt this? What am I trying not to feel? These questions don't heal, but they open. And when something opens, the soul breathes. It is not immediate, it's not light, but it is true. And the soul only reconnects with the truth. She doesn't care about her reputation, doesn't care about your results. She wants image, history, psychic authenticity. And perhaps that's why the symptoms that haunt you the most are precisely those that come closest to your forgotten truth. Because what hurts isn't always what's wrong. Sometimes it's what's most alive. And if you keep trying to eliminate the signs, you may end up erasing the path back to yourself. This is the risk of the obsessive search for happiness. It tries to erase everything that seems incoherent, everything that is out of place, everything that bothers you. But it is precisely these uncomfortable fragments that hold his untold story. And to deny this story is to deny the soul. So the next time your body feels heavy for no reason, that anguish arrives without invitation, that sadness takes over without explanation. Before you try to run away, ask, what is this a metaphor for? It may be that, in this question, you will find again the image that has been waiting for years to be remembered, and for the first time, the symptom stops being an enemy and become guide. But not everyone supports this call, because listening to the symptom requires breaking with a very well-constructed image, the image of well-being. Today, this image has become standard. Happiness is no longer an experience. It has become an obligation, a social code, a sign that you are adjusted, and anyone who dares to show sadness, doubt, or tiredness is seen as dysfunctional, as someone who needs help, correction, to improve. It's not about being happy anymore. It's about looking happy, to behave as if you have found balance, even if everything is cracked inside. This is where happiness turns into compulsion, because the desire to be well has been hijacked by performance, and now, more important than feeling, is appearing. The soul in this scenario does not disappear. She just learns to disguise herself. She continues to scream, but now in the form of productive silence. It continues to demand attention, but now within bodies that function, that deliver, that respond, still alive, but exiled. And that's what makes people sick the most. Positivity has become a kind of invisible morality. Those who are well are praised. Those who show pain are tolerated for a while. Then they are seen as difficult. And that judgment, even when not said out loud, gnaws. You start to wonder if you're overreacting. If not, I should be more grateful. If it's not being a burden. And to survive, he starts editing even what he feels. That's not that serious. There are people going through worse things. I'll take a deep breath and move on. And it continues. But you continue carrying the weight of everything that could not exist in you. This is the new form of repression, the obligation to be well all the time. A repression without shouting, without explicit punishments, but it creates an emotional prison that only those who are resolved can enter. But nobody is. The happy archetype has taken the place of the contemporary hero. The subject who is light, spiritualized, productive, healthy, full. A figure that serves more to feed social networks than to welcome the complexity of the soul. And the worst part is that everyone pretends to believe it. The ready-made phrases, the automatic smiles, shelf spirituality, gratitude used as a shield. All of this makes up the new emotional landscape where pain is censored, not with violence, but with subtlety. Sadness has become an emotional crime. You can feel everything as long as it doesn't show. You can suffer as long as you know how to use the right words. You can implode as long as you keep smiling in meetings. This is the new pact, adapting to the aesthetics of balance, even if inside there is only collapse. And what does this do to the soul? Make her withdraw. She stops trying to speak, stop trying to show pictures, stop being dramatic, and starts to hide. Not out of weakness, but out of survival. Because in a world where only what is light is accepted, the dark soul is banished. But it is in the darkness that it truly shows itself. It is in imbalance that it reveals what still needs to be transformed. It is in discomfort that she points out what is out of place. It is in sadness that she asks for reconstruction. Happiness, when used as a mask, becomes anesthesia. It relieves the pain momentarily, but it also prevents you from listening to it. And without listening, there is no true transition, just repetition. You repeat patterns, repeats behaviors, repeats relationships, until the emptiness screams louder than any trained smile. This is why so many people collapse into silence, not out of weakness, but due to image exhaustion. There comes a point where the soul no longer accepts performance. She wants to be present, even if this presence comes loaded with shadows, even if it scares you, even if it deconstructs everything you've learned to look like. The soul wants to be felt, not acted out. And whoever has the courage to listen to it inevitably breaks with the compulsion for happiness, because you begin to realize that there is nothing crueler than having to smile when what you need is acceptance. You begin to realize that true strength lies not in maintaining the image, but in allowing the inner truth to emerge, even if it is misshapen, even if you are crying, even if you don't know what to say. You begin to realize that being whole is more important than being well, and that realization changes everything. It doesn't make life easy or magical, but it gives meaning back, returns soul, because you stop conforming to the ideal of happiness, and you start to get closer to who you are, with all the layers, with all the pain, with all the humanity. This is the beginning of true freedom, when you realize that you no longer have to look like anything. You don't have to be the strong one anymore, the optimist, the light one, the enlightened one. It might just be you, with its silences, with your memories, with its symptoms not yet translated. It could just be you, listening to the soul with the depth it deserves. And in doing so, for the first time, you feel like you're coming home. But returning home isn't always a relief. Sometimes it's heartbreaking, because when you get closer to yourself, you discover that many parts of you were frozen back there, in pains that were never elaborated, in choices made out of fear, in masks worn so early that today they already look like skin. And the greatest of all these masks is that of emotional balance. That idea that a mature person is, above all, someone who doesn't waver, who reacts calmly, that does not shake, who knows how to keep his mind in place, even when everything is falling apart. But this image, sold as evolution, hides a vice, the vice of stability. You were taught to seek balance as if it were a destiny, a fixed point, a state of emotional security where nothing would knock you off balance. But the axis sometimes needs to be broken, because what you call imbalance may just be the beginning of transformation. The soul is not organized in a linear way. It contorts itself, contradicts itself, falls apart before reforming itself. And whoever tries to always live well, always lives superficially. Run away from pain. Run away from conflict. Avoid ambiguity. Run away from your own soul. The path of individuation, this movement of becoming who you are, is not done in balance. It is done with confrontation, with crossing, with the courage to look at what you have always avoided, in the shade, the anger, the shame, the part of you that feels envy, that wants what you shouldn't, that still sabotages yourself, the part that does not fit into the ideal of the evolved being, and that, for that very reason, holds what is most true in you. When you try too hard to maintain emotional stability, what you're actually avoiding is the plunge, because diving does not guarantee control, ensures depth, and depth always brings discomfort. She reveals her cracks, your limits, your fear of being seen as fragile, but it also reveals its power, that which is not born from the image, but from the well-traversed chaos. It is at this point that the soul differentiates itself from the personality. The personality wants stability, wants recognition, wants to stay presentable. The soul wants truth, even if it costs you your reputation. She wants to go through the ugly, the tense, the contradictory, because she knows that only then is the transformation real. Those who only seek balance live on the surface, avoid extremes. It avoids deep mourning, uncontrollable desire, the loneliness that cleanses. But it is in the extremes that the soul reveals itself. It's in the unedited pain. It is in the fall without explanation. It's the day when you stop everything and feel like you can't go on the same way. This breaking point, which we try so hard to avoid, is often the only place where the soul can manifest itself completely, not as a performance, but as a psychic reality. Have you ever had that moment? A moment when everything seemed wrong, out of place, falling apart, and yet something inside said, "This is what needed to happen. This kind of disorganization is necessary, because the old needs to break so that the new can be born." But nobody prepares you for this. They tell you that the ideal is balance. They sell you peace as if it were a place where nothing affects you anymore. But those who are not affected do not transform, and those who don't transform repeat. Repetition is the destiny of those who live avoiding the crisis. Because without a crisis, there is no crossing. Without crossing, there is no psychic birth. And what arises in place of repressed transformation is emotional stagnation. That feeling of living a life that no longer belongs to you, of being trapped in a script written by others, of staging presence where there is only absence. The search for balance, when it becomes compulsive, prevents this birth. It works as a sedative. It keeps you from going crazy, but it also keeps you from finding yourself again. You stay functional, calm, educated, but inside, you no longer feel anything true, and that is what the soul cannot bear, the absence of truth. She can withstand chaos. You can go through the morning, can withstand losses, emptiness, anguish. What she can't stand is lies, the autoenganō, the attempt to be someone who no longer feels anything so as not to bother. This is why so many collapse into silence, because they held on for too long to a stability that had already expired, because they tried to look good when everything screamed for a breakup, because they were afraid of falling, without knowing that falling sometimes is the only portal. This portal is not pretty, it is not spiritualized, it's not poetic, it's raw, it's dark, it's lonely, but it's real. And in the soul, only reality transforms, only the real reconnects, only the real restructures. The myth of balance needs to die, not because he's bad, but because it became a prison. What the soul wants is movement. It's the dance between light and dark, between knowing and not knowing, between firmness and collapse. She wants to live in cycles, not in a straight line. And when you accept that, when you stop pretending to be consistent, when you allow yourself to fall with dignity, something inside really starts to align, not to the ideal, but to you. And then, for the first time, what you feel becomes more important than what you look like. And that's when the soul finally begins to blossom. But sometimes, in order to flourish, it must first collapse. And this collapse almost always comes without warning, not with a scream, but with a silence deeper than all the others. A silence that does not paralyze, it sinks. That's what happened to him. An ordinary man admired by many. High-level executive, sharp intelligence, charismatic presence. Always with quick responses, always available, always good. Never missed work. He never allowed himself to weaken. He never stopped being in control. He was the kind of person everyone looked up to. And perhaps precisely because of that, no one noticed when he started to disappear. It was subtle. First the sleep that was no longer restful, then the growing irritation which he camouflaged with more productivity, then the strange feeling that everything, absolutely everything, had lost its taste. But he followed, because he learned that stopping was weakness, that showing pain was drama, that not having answers was unacceptable, and then one day it just fell apart, literally. In the middle of a meeting, the body gave out. There were no apparent illnesses. The tests were all normal, but he wasn't there anymore. What collapsed was not the mind, not even the physical. It was the soul, exhausted from being ignored for so long. And this collapse, which seemed absurd at first glance, was actually coherent. The soul cannot bear to live eternally on the margins. She waits. She insists. But there comes a time when it demands passage. And if you don't listen to it by choice, it will come by rupture. That's what happened to that man. At the hospital, no one knew what to say. Doctors looked for physical causes. Colleagues talked about stress. Friends suggested rest, travel, clearing one's mind. But he knew. Deep down, I knew. What collapsed was not the routine. It was the unlived story. All the roles he took on without choice. All the masks he wore to be accepted. All the emotions you had to file away to appear strong. His soul had been shelved for years, locked in a dark room where there was no talk of fear, loss, or failure. And now, she demanded a stage. Not to cause, but to finally exist. The breakdown was the only way to say, I can't stand this performance anymore. And perhaps at this point his story is that of many. How many continue to function, even when everything has collapsed inside? How many continue to deliver, smile, respond, even when there is no more meaning? How many people expect the pain to go away on its own, as if it were something external and not an internal call. What no one says is that collapsing can be a gesture of dignity, not by giving up, but for lucidity, because continuing to live a life that requires you to abandon your soul, that is giving up. Collapsing sometimes is the only form of truth left, and when that happens, there's no point in trying to go back to how things were before. There's no point in putting on makeup with optimism. Don't even try to hide it with distractions. The collapse is ritual. It's a passage. It is a symbol. He comes to break the cycle, to stop the script, to say that something there needs to die, so that you can finally live what is yours, and there is no comfortable return after that. What comes next is not peace, it's reconstruction, with pieces still scattered around, with images that you don't know where to fit, with emotions you can't even name, but it is there, on that unstructured ground, that the soul begins to build its own foundations, no longer based on external expectations, no longer focused on performance, but guided by listening to internal images. Listen to what was once a symptom. Listen to what has been silenced for too long. It took that man, that executive, months to accept that he no longer wanted to go back to being who he was, because who he was never whole. The rupture brought him back to himself, and that return hurt, because the truth, when it arrives after years of emotional lying, tears you apart. But it also heals, not quickly, not with formulas, but with truth. And what he discovered, and what so many discover, is that the real breakdown is not what brings you down, it's what wakes you up. It is the moment when the soul, suffocated from adapting so much, takes the body back, and he says, now it's up to me. And from then on, everything changes, not because it becomes easy, but because it becomes authentic. What you feel can finally be felt. What you desire can finally be desired. What you fear can finally be embraced. No rush, no explanation, without fear of not being well, because being whole is enough. And perhaps that is the only cure the soul recognizes, not the one that eliminates pain, but the one who listens to it with respect. Because there is something that culture has taught us to deny, and yet it carries the seed of the most real transformation. Sadness. Not that passing sadness that comes and goes with the day, but the sadness is deep, the one that arrives like a cloak, that covers everything, that slows down time. The sadness that takes you away from the surface and drags you inward. We learn to treat it as an enemy, avoid it urgently, healing her before she even knows what she means. But what if it's not something to be eliminated? What if it is fertile soil? The psychology of the soul understands sadness as a symbolic power. It is not a sign of weakness. It's countryside, territory where new images can germinate. But to do this, it is necessary to sustain the void. Most do not support it. Core, disguise. It turns into distraction, into work, into a promise of improvement. But sadness has its own rhythm. It demands slowness, it demands presence, it requires you to bow down a little before that which can no longer be ignored. Because not just any sadness can make you sick. It's the one you refuse to feel, the one that was suffocated for years, the one that was pushed into the emotional basement, the one you only allow to visit when no one is looking. This sadness, when denied, rots from within, but when welcomed, it fertilizes. She rearranges psyche, dispels false narratives, reveals images that were buried. Because true sadness has memory. She remembers what you forgot. She returns to the places where you abandoned yourself. She shows you with brutal delicacy the parts of yourself that you let die in order to survive. And that hurts, but it is a fertile pain. It is the necessary mourning for everything you didn't experience, for the versions of themselves that needed to be silenced, for the loves you endured for fear of being alone, for the words you didn't say, for the limits he did not impose. Sadness comes to take care of that, not as consolation, but as a right. She transforms pain into a symbol, and the symbol in language, but only if you don't run away, only if you have the courage to stay in the dark for a while. Because the dark is where the soul sees best. In the forced clarity of positivity, everything seems too resolved. Everything is fast. Everything has a name, a technique, a way out. But in the dark, you don't pretend. You don't get it wrong, unable to maintain performance. That's why the soul loves sadness, because that's where you undress, There is no other emotional state that leaves you so naked before yourself, so fragile, so honest, and precisely for that reason, so available for reconfiguration. Sadness dissolves structures, and what dissolves can be recreated. But to do that, you have to cross over, not as a victim, but as someone who honors their own pain, as someone who understands that suffering, when listened to with maturity, reveals paths that were invisible. It is in this sense that sadness is symbolic intelligence. It doesn't solve it, but it guides, doesn't explain, but it shows, with images, with memories that come back out of nowhere, with strange dreams, with a melancholy that has smell, color, rhythm. All this is the soul speaking. This is all your psyche trying to reteach you what you forgot, that there is beauty in what was left, that there is power in what still hurts, that there is meaning in what seems to have no solution. Those who only seek the clear blind themselves, because continuous light is also blindness. Permanent light prevents the birth of new images, prevents silence, prevents pausing, and the soul needs a break, needs night, needs fall, needs emptiness, not to get lost, but to reorganize, like the earth that needs to be moved for something to sprout, like winter before spring, like the body that needs to stop before taking a new step. Sadness is this soil where the psyche learns to retell itself, not with the words of the world, but with the words that are born from your own silence. And these words do not come in a hurry. They come when you give up pretending, when you surrender, when for the first time you say to yourself, I accept this pain as part of my path. And then, the sadness begins to change color. It stops being a shadow and starts being a contour. Start outlining what you want to keep and what needs to die. You start to separate what is you from what was just survival. And at that point, it doesn't hurt like it used to. It pulses, as if to say, we are ready to go. No, because everything turned out fine, but because everything became more real, and the soul only walks alongside the truth. But what remains? When did you spend your life running away from it? When did you live trying to please, trying to be okay, trying to keep the peace, even as the world implodes from within? What remains when the pursuit of happiness becomes a form of anesthesia? This is the question that echoes when silence finally can no longer be postponed. You look back and realize how many times you stopped feeling in order to adapt. How many times have you avoided discomfort in the name of stability? How many versions of you were abandoned to fit an ideal that was never yours? The ideal of happiness, of the full, of the enlightened. But inside, the cracks are still there, and it is precisely in them that the soul reveals itself. She doesn't show up on the day of the conquest, not even at the moment of victory. She appears in the interval, in the pause between one role and another, the moment the mask slips, and what's behind finally breathes. The soul does not seek happy endings. She seeks presence, search for drama, seeks contradiction, search for density, because it is in excess, in error, in doubt, that it finds meaning. Happiness as a constant goal paralyzes, freezes spontaneity, prevents falling, and the fall, for the soul, is a portal. That's why pain is often the only thing that still connects you to yourself. She forces you to stop. It forces you to look. It forces you to listen to voices you've avoided for too long. And it is at this point that everything reverses. You realize that what hurt so much wasn't the suffering itself. It was the effort to avoid it. The tension of staying functional when everything was calling for collapse. The guilt of not being able to fit into an emotional pattern that never made sense. The soul, when heard, does not demand that you improve. She asks you to become real, even if it means being misunderstood, even if it turns some people off, even if it costs you the image you have built up until now. Because the truth of the soul costs, but it's the only price worth paying. And in the end, what scares the most is not the pain felt. That's what it reveals. How much you missed out on living trying to appear whole. But there is still time. Time to listen, to reconfigure, to reincarnate your own story with more presence, more silence, more truth. You don't have to run away anymore. Not even explaining, not even adjust. You can just go back, return to what was left. Go back to who you were before you learned to please. Return to the images that were silenced, Return to the soul that never left you, just waited to be remembered. And perhaps this is the greatest freedom, no longer being happy all the time, but to be whole even when everything inside is still under construction. This is the soul in motion, not perfect, but present. And presence, unlike forced happiness, is something that doesn't paralyze. She transforms. And now, breathing. If something inside you recognized this path, even if it was painful, it's because your soul started to be heard, and she knows. Even when you still don't know how to continue, she knows. All it needs is silence, of space, of courage, and she continues. Like you, for you, inside you. If this video touched you, welcomed you, or reminded you of something that was forgotten within you, subscribe to the channel. Here is a space where the soul no longer needs to hide. And comment below, I allow myself to hear what hurts. Because that's where, right there, that everything starts to align.